All right. Well, it looks like we've got a few more people coming on. So, Ron, I think I can take it away if you're ready.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So welcome, everyone. I hope everyone's morning is off to a great start. So this is Lori Barrow talking to you. I'm the Information Transfer Specialist and Forest Service Liaison for the South Atlantic LCC, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the Third Thursday Web Forum. And for those of you who've never joined us for the Web Forum before, as the name implies, on the third Thursday of each month, the South Atlantic hosts this Web Forum that provides a pretty unique opportunity to share information and generate dialogue about what we're doing and how it's getting done within the South Atlantic. And each web forum follows roughly the same agenda. The format consists of a brief introduction of the presenter, sorry, my words are slurring, followed by a 20 to 35 minute presentation on a mission relevant topic. And then following the presentation, there will be a block of time set aside to ask questions on the presentation. And then the remainder of the time will include a brief update about your cooperative and an open discussion where anyone can ask questions about what the SALCC is up to or how you can get involved. So before we get into the presentation, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. I'm going to mute everyone during the presentation so we don't get any of that background noise. But if you have any questions, you can type them directly into the chat box that's available through WebEx. I have Janet monitoring the chat box, so we'll get to those questions during and after the presentation. Then, of course, during the discussion part, if you do have any questions, all you need to do is *6 to unmute yourself. So with that, before I mute everybody, or most of you are probably muted already. Does anyone have any questions about this before I mute everybody? Okay, great. So I just want to do a few introductions. So if the SALCC staff could unmute themselves and give their introduction, I'd appreciate that.
Good morning. This is Ken McDermott. I'm the coordinator of the South Atlantic. Mute on.
Just
mute off.
Amy, if you could...
Hi, this is Amy Keister. I'm the GIS coordinator for your South Atlantic LCC.
Great. And as I mentioned, I'm Lori Barrow, the communications gal and Forest Service liaison. And Janet, are you out there? Well, Janet's on, so she's watching the chat box. So we'll move forward. And Rua, our science coordinator, is actually on vacation or on leave this week, so he's not joining us today. So I just wanted to give a brief introduction to our presenter. Today with us, we have a conservation scientist, Ron Sutherland from the Wildlands Network. And Ron, I'm going to pass you the power, so just give me a second to stop sharing my desktop. And you will get the power.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Or at least can people that aren't muted hear me?
You're good, Ron.
Good. Thank you. Okay. And now I'm presuming you can see my PowerPoint here.
Sure can.
And let me start it up. There. We good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm happy to have another chance to talk to everyone about the research we've been doing on behalf of the LCC. And it's going to be a bit of an update. We did share some of the same information back in February as a brown bag. But it looks like we've got a pretty different group this time for the webinar, so I'm not going to worry too much about overlap. But our project has been ongoing for the last couple of years, and we're trying to identify and prioritize key habitat connectivity areas for the South Atlantic region. Let's see. And I want to thank, of course, the LCC for funding, and I also want to thank some various private donors that have also supported this project as we've gone along. The collaborators, besides myself, were Conrad Riding, who just left Wildlands Network, Rachel Carnes and Derek Fedak has helped me here in Durham, and Rob Baldwin and Paul Leonard down at Clemson University have been carrying a lot of the heavy modeling load down there. And then there are lots of other collaborators, including a lot of experts who have helped with the project. So, in terms of why habitat connectivity, and this is going to be the abbreviated version, skim through this really quick. I assume most of you are familiar with this now. But in a nutshell, habitat connectivity is important because we think that a lot of species can't survive in small protected areas that aren't connected to other ones. First and foremost, for demographic reasons, small protected areas, small nature reserves just can't hold enough animals to maintain a demographically viable population. But if you connect a series of them with corridors or connectivity areas and allow that demographic interchange to occur, you end up getting a much larger population. It's also important for genetic health of a species to enable that kind of interchange, so you don't end up with a series of inbred populations. And then also from the standpoint of helping species respond to environmental change, like climate change and also sea level rise, species need to be able to move, and providing logical pathways for them to do so is an important goal. So that's what we're trying to do, and it's a big mission for Wildlands Network to try to help everyone think about habitat connectivity in a more detailed way. We're by no means the first to be thinking about habitat connectivity for the Southeast in general. In fact, Florida's got a great ecological greenway network plan and several other schemes that are based on that that we would like to see one day have all the states in the Southeast have something similar. So I encourage you to look at Florida's plans if you haven't already. In a nutshell, what would be nice is to have a prioritized map of key connectivity regions like this for the rest of the region. And some of the folks that started the Florida effort, Reed Noss and Larry Harris, were actually also some of the folks that helped inspire the launch of my organization, Wildlands Network. And then since then, Tom Hochter and a lot of his colleagues have carried the ball down in Florida and putting these excellent models together. So we're just trying to update some of those models for the South Atlantic region. There's a lot of it's become a bit of a cottage industry in the conservation science world to make your own connectivity modeling software package. There's at least a dozen of them now, maybe 2 dozen, if you look hard enough. And they're starting to come out in ways that allow you to take advantage of modern computing power and all the different geospatial data that's available. So we're going to try to use some of these newer models to map out connectivity areas for the region. So that's our goal, to map out current and future habitat connectivity, and from the standpoint of multiple groups of terrestrial wildlife species. So I think there's another project looking at aquatic connectivity. And to update this project goal, we want to do this in a way that feeds directly into the South Atlantic LCC's optimum conservation design process, and yield some indicators that are useful for monitoring progress towards achieving that optimal conservation design. The focal species we settled on 2 groups: the large, wide-ranging mammals, the ones that particularly need habitat connectivity just because there's no one protected area that's large enough for maintaining their populations. The black bear being the only one that's really widespread in the LCC, but then the red wolf and the Florida panther being 2 species that have the potential to recover to more of the LCC. And then for the purposes of contrast, we added in some reptiles, large terrestrial reptiles, eastern diamondback rattlesnake, on the lower left, the pine snake, both the northern pine snake and the Florida pine snake and the black pine snake, that kind of thing. I guess the black pine snake's not in the South Atlantic LCC, but and then the timber rattlesnake, another good species, and then the box turtle. And these species, they don't cover as much ground as the large mammals, but they're much worse at crossing roads, and so we think they provide a good contrast and a good emphasis for targeting. If you're going to build a terrestrial habitat connectivity network, then species like this that crawl slowly across roads and don't have the capacity to cover 50 miles in a night like a wolf might be good ones to consider. So here's the South Atlantic LCC study area outlined in the polygon, and then the pink buffer around that is what we've decided to use as our actual study area. It's a 100-kilometer buffer of the LCC, and that is going to help us minimize edge effects within the actual LCC boundaries that we care about. So by pushing the study area out a good ways, then we're able to avoid some of the edge effects that are very common in this sort of connectivity modeling exercise. Things get distorted on the edges of your study area, and so we're hoping to avoid that. And one of the modeling tools we've been focusing on, with the help from the folks at Clemson, is Circuscape. And I probably shouldn't spend too much time trying to explain it, but it basically uses an electrical theory model to simulate the movement of plants or animals across the landscape. You feed it in a set of nodes, or electrodes, basically, between pairs of which you're going to pass current, and then you also feed it a resistance surface that is sort of a codified version of the landscape that says how hard is it for an animal or plant to move across any given pixel of the landscape. And Circuscape takes that and literally treats it as a giant circuit board, and then it uses electrical theory to calculate how much current would, on the way from node A to node B, how much current would go across all the different parts of the landscape at once. So that's how Circuscape works. And our collaborators at Clemson, particularly Paul Leonard, have made a lot of progress in learning how to use Circuscape on a giant parallel processing machine, which is going to has allowed us to do some really fine-grained connectivity analysis across a really wide area with the LCC buffered 100 kilometers in all directions. So that's the exciting part about this project. Now, just to walk you, I'm going to do more this time than back in February. It'll be more of a walkthrough of our models and how we put together the resistance layers. But in a nutshell, you start with the basic land cover data shown here, 2006 NLCD, and then you need some way of turning that information into resistance, and we used expert surveys. And I think at least a few of our expert questionnaire respondents are on this call, I noticed. So we put together a fairly lengthy survey asking all kinds of different, rather difficult questions about how a given species, one of our target species, responds to different landscape conditions. And we sent those out, over 100 surveys sent out to quite a few different experts. Some of the experts, of course, overlapped, particularly the herp folks, and overlapped with each other, and then the mammal folks overlapped. So, but we had good response rates and got a lot of good information back, and that helps us overcome the lack of good data that's out there, particularly of the species here. Maybe the black bear might qualify as the best studied of all the 7 species we're talking about. But for a lot of the other species, there's just not enough data out there to empirically derive these resistance surfaces of how hard it is for a species to move across the landscape. And resistance also, at least in my mind, captures mortality risk as well. And it's not just how fast you move across a given pixel of the landscape, but it's also how likely you are to die. So that comes into play more. So here's some of the results from the expert questionnaires. A fair bit of variation, as you might expect with anything based on expert opinion. But the basic trend is what we would expect. On the left side, you see some of the developed land cover types, and they had high resistance at a scale of 0 to 100 or 1 to 100. And then in the middle, you see the more natural land cover types, the forests and shrub and scrub and herbaceous areas had pretty low resistance. And we saw that again for the mammals the same way. So more or less as we expected. Same thing for traffic. We asked them to rank different levels of traffic for each species on that scale of 1 to 100. So here's the NLTD layer, zooming in on the southern part of the LTC study region. And then here's what happens if you take the expert questionnaire averages for eastern cougar / Florida panther and reclassify those according to our results, and you get a landscape. You can see Elena up on the northwest side of the picture there shows up as having really high resistance, and then on the southeast side, that large blue area is the kind of the Okefenokee complex, having pretty low resistance. So that's what you're looking at here. This is just a straight reclassification of land cover. We wanted to incorporate distance from shore, from water. Open water is a complicated thing when you're thinking about animal movement. So a lot of the species don't think twice about crossing minor water gaps. A bear is not going to hesitate to swim across even a fairly wide body of water. So we wanted to incorporate that in the models, but also incorporate the fact that we didn't want the ocean to end up being an identified corridor for terrestrial species to move around coastal cities, which will happen if you don't pay specific attention to this kind of thing in your models. Not to say it's actually going to happen. So we reclassified all the open water in the landscape according to its distance from shore, and then gave those values scores corresponding to our expectation that as you get out to a certain distance, it becomes impossible for a species to move. So we actually ended up reclassifying some of the really far areas out from shore as no data. So that way the CircuitScape program wouldn't even consider moving animals across there. And then we added that back in, burned that back into the land cover resistance. And we also wanted to incorporate protected areas for two reasons. One, because we thought protected areas would have slightly lower mortality risk. Not that the habitat, well, actually three reasons. One, the habitat tends to be managed better on protected areas and is a little bit more natural, and so that the species might have even the land cover type might be the same. If a protected area probably has a little bit lower resistance for movement because of that. And then two, the mortality risk in protected areas is, at least in theory, a bit lower. And then three, protected areas represent conservation infrastructure that's already been sunk to a certain extent. And we felt like it made sense to put a little bit of a bias into our connectivity models that would steer connectivity from these protected areas to use them. So what we ended up settling on was treating protected areas, giving them a modification factor for the land cover resistance that cut the land cover resistance in half. No matter what it was, if it was protected, it got cut in half. If that makes sense. So here is the eastern cougar land cover resistance with protected areas built in. You can see they stand out a little bit more after you do that. Now, in terms of mortality risk, the highways and the roads pose a really great threat. We wanted to do that, incorporate those rather explicitly. Unfortunately, there's no great unified traffic layer for the southeast. Some of the individual states have great traffic layers, but they're not very comparable. And so trying to do things across across this larger scale, we would get really bad edge effects as we cross from one state to another. So to avoid that, we've settled on sort of what the best we can possibly do, we think, which is a hybrid approach of using the Federal Highway Performance Monitoring System data, which actually does have traffic information, the average daily traffic for most of the major roads in the country, really, but including this region. And then we've merged that with a data set that's available from ESRI that does a good job, we think, of capturing and ranking different levels of medium-sized roads. So we merged those two together, and then we used Tiger road data to fill in all the smaller roads and gave them a pretty low resistance. The larger roads, we assigned a resistance value based on their actual, the expert survey, what the experts thought that level of traffic should get. If that makes sense. And then,
hold on a second. A question on that is that we're using the road width at all as a resistance factor?
No, we decided not to, in part because it would be difficult to get across the whole area, but in fact you probably could incorporate that if you wanted to. It's a good question. I imagine it's fairly well correlated with traffic. As you get more and more average daily traffic, you get more a wider road. But for a species like a box turtle, the road width is certainly an important factor. So we asked around. Some of you may have seen us asking around for anybody that had great data on wildlife crossings across the study area, and we got some data on that. We also wanted to include bridges to the extent that we thought they were useful. So we made a subset of all the bridges in the region that were the large bridges that went over either waterways or railroads, basically places where we thought that a smart bear or smart wolf or extremely smart rattlesnake might take advantage of it. It was going to cross an interstate. There's all these holes already, so we did incorporate bridges into the model in that way. But we avoided culverts. We didn't use any culverts. They had to be, I think, the bridge had to be 20 meters wide, and then we assigned the bridges a slightly lower resistance based on the species-specific ranking that we had. So here's eastern cougar, zooming in on Atlanta with the bridges built in. So it becomes a pretty complicated thing. And then we also wanted to, even though we're doing a fine-scaled habitat analysis for these species at the 90-meter resolutions at what we settled on doing, which is pretty fine-scaled, we recognize that the range of perception for these different species might actually exceed that. And so for the large mammals, we included a landscape metric as well, where we took the land cover and roads resistance layers and we buffered them, or we did a moving window analysis with I think a 5-kilometer window, and then added that back to the original land cover and road resistance to get it unified. So this is the 5-kilometer buffer of resistance. You can see it kind of smooths things over and highlights the places like Okefenokee and Apalachicola National Forest that have really low landscape resistance. And then we added that back in to the other two layers on equal footing to derive a composite final resistance layer for eastern cougar. And that's what you see here. And that ranges, I think, on a scale of essentially 0 to 300, if I'm remembering correctly. So the dark blue area is very low resistance, and then the red or the cream and yellow areas are really high resistance. And then what we wanted to do from there was develop nodes. I mentioned Circuitscape uses nodes, so you have to feed it some nodes, and for different situations that can be very complicated or very difficult to do or very easy. And for our species, it's relatively complicated, and we've hit on an interesting approach I don't think anybody else has ever tried, and so I'm happy to try to explain it here for the first time. So we basically decided that since we didn't have great models of species distribution for these species across the entire study area, much less a model that would indicate which areas were source areas capable of sending out dispersing animals, we decided to use the resistance layer we already had, using the expert data that we already had, and zoom and focus in on areas of the lowest resistance across the landscape for a given species, and call those the nodes, essentially. So we repeated the landscape smoothing thing. We looked at landscape scale resistance, but even at a larger scale. This is, I think, a 10-kilometer window for eastern cougar. And then we said, show us given that landscape resistance, show us the areas that have the lowest overall resistance to dispersal for cougar, and we thresholded them out, and here are those areas. We call them eco-blocks. Other people have used that term for something similar. And then we cut those areas with major roads, and that tended to dice them up a little bit, make them smaller. And to be sure that those remaining polygons were still useful for our purposes, we calculated how much habitat was in each of them for each species, and then trimmed them down further to only those polygons that were large enough to have enough habitat to have at least a handful of breeding females for a given species. For eastern cougar, I think we settled on something, over 1,000 square kilometers of suitable habitat within a block of low resistance. So we did that, and then for Circuitscape to work really well on the supercomputer at the scale we're trying to do it, we needed the nodes to be points rather than polygons, and so we came up with the, I think, pretty clever approach of saying, hey, we've got these polygons representing low resistance areas around the landscape. We want to convert them to points. Why not just take the point of lowest absolute resistance within each polygon? And that's what we were able to do. Here you can see that you're looking at resistance values within those core polygons for eastern cougar, and then if you can see these are the lowest points of lowest resistance within each one, and those points are what we ended up saying this is what we're going to use for nodes in Circuitscape. And we think those areas, these points represent basically places with few roads and relatively low mortality for a given species, and thus they're the most likely to be generating dispersing young animals that would set out across the landscape. So it seemed logical to us to use those. And so we fed those into the supercomputer down at Clemson, and it cranked away for a few days, and these are some of the results we're getting back. And it says gene flow. Circuitscape has been used to model gene flow, but this is not to say we've done any particular estimation of gene flow. You might expect that gene flow might follow these patterns. And again, I should say that also that I forgot to mention before, particularly for the large mammals, we decided to focus on potential habitat connectivity across the region and not just focus on areas where the species already were, because the Florida panther is not even in the LCC, even the buffered LCC region. There's not any breeding panther populations that I know of, and the red wolf, of course, is only in eastern North Carolina. But so instead, we focused on potential connectivity across the region. And what we've found, and these results, I should also point out, are preliminary. They're just hot off the press. So I'm happy to show them to you, but we're still in the process of figuring them out ourselves and making sure they make sense, making sure everything works the right way. And what it appears to show us is that the southern and western part of the study region has a lot of nodes, and as a result, you have lots of pairs of nodes, and those pairs of nodes, when you stack up all the current flowing between those pairs of nodes, that tends to dominate the picture for eastern cougar in this case. You get a pretty interesting pattern showing up there. We can keep going. The red wolf, this is the red wolf output that we just got, and it has a different feel to it. It looks less like a series of corridors across the landscape and looks more like sort of 1,000 points of light. So we're still trying to figure out exactly what influenced that. But the red wolf had a higher number of nodes in the eastern part of the Carolinas, and so you get more flow going over there. But again, a pretty strong concentration in the wilds of southwest Georgia and eastern Alabama. And then here's the black bear model. Came out pretty similar in some respects, but it shows a much higher flow in the mountains and surprisingly high flow in the kind of the fall line sandhills area of South Carolina and Georgia, and then not as much flow as we were expecting to see in the coastal Carolinas, particularly coastal North Carolina, which has a really robust population of bears. So we're still trying to figure that up and out. Part of it has to do, you see here, with the, it's all relative, and so if you rescale eastern North Carolina relative to the maximum in eastern North Carolina, then you start to see that, the pattern of flow becomes apparent again. So that's where we're at. We're still waiting on the reptile models, and we might be waiting for a little while there because the number of pairs of nodes for the reptile models goes up quite a bit. In fact, like box turtles might not end up being computationally feasible, but we're still trying to figure that out. There might be some ways that we can further improve the model. We've done a lot of improvements to Circuitscape. Paul's basically reprogrammed Circuitscape himself to make it work at this scale and on the parallel processing machine. And so I think we can continue to make those improvements. Those are some of the results from Circuitscape. We're also running a different program, the Connectivity Analysis Toolkit, that's put together by Carlos Carroll. And it's different from Circuitscape in one major respect, which is that rather than focus on nodes, Connectivity Analysis Toolkit considers every hexagon across the landscape and looks at potential connections between every pair of those hexagons. So you can end up with results that look like this, very, very angular. But it's the same basic scenario. You start with resistance, you convert it for this program, you convert it to conductance, the inverse of resistance, and then you feed that in and you get something that looks like this. This is shortest path between the centrality for eastern cougar in the study region. And I actually really like this a lot. I think it simplifies the landscape pretty well, and it prioritizes things based on their centrality. And what this is really, what shortest path between the centrality is really showing you here is if you took every pair of hexagon grid cells across the landscape and you drew the least cost path on the resistance surface between those pairs of hexagons, and you stack up all those results, the linear routes between those pairs of hexagons that get the most traffic of all those different least cost paths show up in this map as the darker, cooler colors. And so you can, it does a great job, essentially, of highlighting places where a lot of flow across the landscape would tend to stack up, and those would be important places to consider for protecting wildlife habitat corridors, we think. So, and this analysis was not done at the 90-meter scale. It's being done at the 200-hectare scale, which is still relatively small, and it's kind of bleeding edge for this program. We tried it using a much smaller scale, and then Carlos Carroll told us that we were trying to do the impossible, and we were doing trillions and quadrillions of calculations, and it wasn't going to work. So that explained why it wasn't working. But so we're still waiting to get all these results together, and then there's going to be still a little bit of work to do to try to interpret them and simplify them and integrate the two models into a priority scheme for connectivity conservation in the region. So that, I think, in a nutshell, is kind of where we're at on this project. And I'd be happy to answer some more questions.
Well, that was great, Ron. Thank you so much for that presentation and for sharing some of your preliminary results. And right now we have time for some questions, perhaps around 10 minutes worth of time if we need it. Just a reminder that in order to code in, you just need to hit *6.
Hey, Ron, this is Ken.
Hey, Ken.
Where does the piece about the future change, the habitat change, whether it's from sea level rise or other factors, come into your work?
All right. I totally left that out. It's actually, we don't have any results to show for that, but we have the node layers and resistance layers all ready to run. So that's an excellent point. So what I just showed you was the contemporary connectivity, and then we've also put together resistance layers for the year 2100 using the urban projections from the CIRAP group that you guys are familiar with for that year, and then also trying to incorporate sea level rise. We're trying to use SLAM models, and the major obstacle using SLAM was that the SLAM model petered out right at the end of the LCC, and so we couldn't use it for our entire buffer area. But so at the moment we're using a much simpler but easier to extrapolate the bathtub model of sea level rise, just to show in a kind of in a conservative way, or maybe a worst case scenario way, what could happen if sea level rise happens to the extent that it could happen, and if urbanization happens to the extent that it could happen, then what's going to happen to these potential habitat corridors that we're identifying. And we're essentially rerunning the entire analysis, identifying new nodes, and showing which places will still be there after you get the, if you haven't seen the urban projections that the folks have done, they're rather daunting, and the sea level rise is scary in some places and less scary in other places, but the urban projections are scary, and so we think it's important to do that as well. So those results will be forthcoming as well.
Thanks. Ron, this is Doug Newcomb.
Hi, Doug.
I have a couple of questions. First off, on sea level rise, what resolution are you working at to do your bathtub modeling?
I think 30 meters is what we found the easiest data set for, which is, are you talking the grain size or the resolution of?
Oh, the base resolution of the elevation data.
The elevation, yeah. We'll have to check on what that is. I think we went with something that was relatively coarse but quickly available. So we're not trying to do a detailed LiDAR analysis for this.
Okay, thank you. The second question would be, you had to half the resistance for the protected areas of your models in your analysis. What was the basis for having the resistance? And did you model without that halving of the resistance?
Right. It ends up being half of the land cover resistance. It doesn't affect the traffic resistance, and then it gets incorporated into the landscape scale resistance. So it's out of a scale of 300. It's not a full half of that gets taken off. But again, the rationale was that protected areas offer relatively safe havens for species. Obviously, it'd be great to distinguish places where bears can be hunted versus places that bears can't be hunted. But for our purposes, we went with kind of a simplified generic approach of looking across. And half is definitely an arbitrary threshold for what we could have done, but it seemed to be enough to steer the models without totally biasing them in favor of protected areas. So, and the trick with, we haven't done very much in the way of comprehensive sensitivity analysis for this, just because it takes to run the model on the supercomputer takes quite a bit of time and energy, and so we can't run hundreds of repeats with all the different variables at different levels. But I think it makes sense. We probably should try running it without as well, just to see what happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike Harris here. This might be more of a question for Rua maybe, but how do we incorporate this into the blueprint design, Rua? The species are different from our indicator species. Will this be part of the thing that the team will be figuring out as they start to build the blueprint, or do you have some general ideas already about that?
Hey, Mike, this is Ken. Rua isn't here. He's on vacation this week.
Oh, okay.
I'll have to get back to you on that one, because I would say yes, it's one of the things that we're going to consider as we look to the future. And I think, Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is actually one of the this actual connectivity is one of the indicators that we established.
That's correct, Ken. And so talking about the indicators, and you all know we have a goal to have these indicators mapped and up for review in August, which is getting really close now. And so this is one of the indicators that is representing landscapes. And so if you all remember, we had some specific indicators for each of our habitats, but then we also had landscapes and waterscapes. And so Ron's work that he just presented is one of the indicators that is representing landscapes. And so we'll have, Ron's wrapping up and reviewing the data now, and it's one of those indicators that will be available in August for all of us to review and start to make decisions in our workshops about how to use this information in the blueprint.
Thanks, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Ron, this is Rick. Can you hear me?
Hey, Rick.
Hey. So a couple questions about eastern North Carolina. One, and it's surprising that the habitat values came out pretty low, even for black bear. Even when you did the kind of zoom in, it was surprisingly low. And the areas of highest bear density, like out on the Albemarle Peninsula, for example, come out as very as not very high value. And I'm wondering why that would be. And then a corollary to that is with the panther or cougar data. Is that influenced by the source of the cougar population, which is South Florida, and so things that are farther away are necessarily lower value? So those are my kind of two related questions.
Yeah, well, the second one's easier to answer, and that no, we didn't incorporate the source populations at all. And in fact, that at least part of what's going on for the first question with the black bear is that our models they focused strictly sort of on resistance, and it was potential resistance for potential distribution of the species, and so it wasn't designed to incorporate bear density in a particular way. But I'm actually just as surprised as you are at the way that model turned out. So I'm actually, we're going to spend some time reviewing to make sure it actually worked the way it was supposed to work, because it's perplexed me as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I had the same response.
I mean, unfortunately, trying to double-check the math that a supercomputer did is not strictly easy, but I think there's ways we can get at doing it.
Okay, great. So if there's is there any other questions for Ron at this time?
Will the reptile resistance maps be posted on the website as they become available, or would it make sense to just do a section of the area if we can't compute something for the whole area, or what's sort of the status of those going forward?
That's a good question. We should finish the connectivity analysis toolkit reptile models fairly soon, and those will come up. And whether or not we can, the big holdup is going to be the box turtle, and because for the circuitscape analysis, box turtle ended up with 17,000 different potential pairs of nodes to consider across the entire landscape, and which is really cool.
The answer is you don't have to worry about them.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The idea with box turtles is they'll provide the finest scale, habitat connectivity possible. For any species you want to consider, box turtle's got to be one that it needs habitat connectivity, but it's a pretty small ranging species, and doesn't need vast areas of habitat to hang on. But it may be that we have to readjust our computational ambitions for that model. But we'll definitely post things as soon as they're ready.
Okay, great. Well, Ron, thank you again so much for presenting. I'm going to use the last 10 minutes to just give some South Atlantic LCC updates. So if you have any further questions, Ron has his information up there, so I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any more either by giving him a call or through email. So thank you, Ron.
Oh, thank you guys for listening.
I'm going to take back the power now. So, alrighty. So I just want to make sure. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just a few South Atlantic LCC updates. So the next Third Thursday web forum will be given by the members of the South Atlantic LCC staff, and it will be a draft State of the South Atlantic, which will look at the past, current, and future of the South Atlantic indicators, and Amy and Rua will be the primary presenters for that. So that'll take place on August 15th. Again, meet here at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. So just a few other updates. The steering committee recently approved a new seat at the table specifically to represent cultural resources. So Ramona Bartos, the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer, will serve as chair of the Cultural Resources Committee and represent that group on the South Atlantic LCC Steering Committee. So we welcome her, and this position will actually rotate among Cultural Resource Committee members annually. And then Janet actually provided me with another update on the Cultural Resource Committee, which is developing draft indicators and targets that will be proposed to steering committee meeting members for consideration and hopefully be approved at the next meeting next month in August. And then if you are part of the South Atlantic Webs community, you should have received a save the date for several upcoming regional workshops to help inform the future design of the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint. These workshops are going to be hands-on and open to anyone, where you'll be working in small groups with a number of GIS building blocks, such as LCC indicator models or threat layers, to build potential blueprints for parts of the South Atlantic. These workshops are intended to provide an opportunity to work with diverse folks throughout your cooperative to discuss the future of land, freshwater, ocean, and cultural resources that we're all responsible for. And specific details are still in development, but we wanted to make sure you had as much notice as possible. So more details should be available in August's newsletter, which comes out somewhere roughly in the first week of August. And you can always find out more details on the South Atlantic LCC website. We have a whole tab dedicated to the development of the blueprint. And the workshops will be set in 2 locations, as you can see. One will be in Raleigh on October 22nd and 23rd, and one hosted in Savannah on November 19th and 20th. And there's no need to actually, you only need to go to one. So again, I just want to thank everybody for participating in the web forum, and just wanted to share some ways to get involved with the South Atlantic web community. We host a really active website, so if you're not already a member, you can go ahead and join the South Atlantic web community, where you can post updates on projects or interesting topics that are coming out or papers. You can connect with a staff member. All of us are here and ready to serve you. Or you can communicate with the steering committee member to get your organization involved. And the website's just below there. And I just wanted to take the opportunity and allow folks to ask any questions about what the South Atlantic LCC is up to. You can ask away, and again, just *6 if you have any questions. Well, if there's no questions, again, thank you everybody for participating in today's web forum, and hopefully we'll see you in August. Well, not see you, listen to you. All right, thank you everybody. Oh, and just a reminder that we have recorded these, so if you had to log in late or leave early, they are available online now. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Ron.
Thanks.